All the latest now with the ITV News at 10.
As Ghislaine Maxwell awaits her sentence for sex trafficking, her victims speak of their relief. Women who she groomed to be sexually abused have finally seen justice done, and their lawyers are warning of further prosecutions.
I think more perpetrators can and should be brought to justice if there are accusers who are credible and brave and they come forward.
Also tonight, more beds for hospitals as COVID admissions rise again. And in a simple wooden coffin, Archbishop Desmond Tutu lies in state.
This is ITV News with Geraint, Vincent.
Good evening. One important step towards justice. So said one of the victims of Ghislaine Maxwell today as they spoke of their relief after the British socialite was found guilty of 5 out of 6 charges in her sex trafficking trial. Maxwell groomed underage girls to be abused by her former partner Jeffrey Epstein for years. Our US correspondent Emma Murphy reports.
She was described as a sophisticated predator, a woman who preyed on the young and vulnerable to satisfy her friend and former lover's lust for underage girls. Ghislaine Maxwell lured them to their homes. One of those they targeted told of being invited to their isolated New Mexico ranch by Maxwell, only to be subject to a naked massage by her, and then forced to run from her bed when Epstein got into it.
I think justice is a complicated term, but I was speaking with another Epstein survivor last night, and I think she said it well. She said this is one important step towards justice, and I think in this particular case we know there were other people involved and other perpetrators, and we certainly hope that there will continue to be investigations so that other people will be held accountable for the ways that they abused people.
A jury unanimously found Maxwell guilty of 5 of the 6 charges she faced, including trafficking of girls for sex. The 60-year-old barely flinched as the verdicts were returned. She poured herself a glass of water as her lawyer patted her back. Then she was returned to custody. Those who represent other victims of Epstein have welcomed the outcome of a decade-long quest for justice.
My clients and I were moved to tears that this day has finally come. This woman who has caused so much suffering to so many girls and women is finally convicted of crime. She is a convicted sex trafficker. She's had 60 years of freedom, and may she never walk free another day of her life. I think more perpetrators can and should be brought to justice if there are accusers who are credible and brave and they come forward.
Ghislaine Maxwell's legal team spent 5 weeks discrediting the testimonies of women who described in awful detail how their lives were changed by her actions. That legal team maintains her innocence.
We firmly believe in Ghislaine's innocence. Obviously, we are very disappointed with the verdict. We have already started working on the appeal, and we are confident that she will be vindicated.
The rest of Ghislaine Maxwell's life rests on that appeal. Having taken so many childhoods, she is likely to spend the rest of her life as a prisoner. Emma Murphy, ITV News.
Ghislaine Maxwell was a friend of Prince Andrew and introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. She appeared in the background of a photograph of the prince with the woman, Virginia Giuffre, who's now bringing a civil case against him. Well, our royal editor, Chris Shipp, joins us. Chris, what does this verdict mean for the prince?
Well, Geraint, we should be clear, it was Ghislaine Maxwell who was on trial here, not Prince Andrew. But I think following the verdict, we remind ourselves of the words, the Prince's own words in that Newsnight interview when he said he'd been friends with Ghislaine since university. And it was for her that he arranged that, open quotes, straightforward shooting weekends, his words, I should remind you, at Sandringham for her birthday. And of course, then there is that photo that you mentioned with Ghislaine Maxwell in the background, Prince Andrew with his arms around around his main accuser, Virginia Giuffre. Now, she is suing him separately, and that case is back in the courts in New York next week. But she tweeted her response to Maxwell's verdict in the last 24 hours. Virginia Giuffre said, "I hope that today is not the end, but rather another step in justice being served. Maxwell did not act alone. Others must be held accountable." Now, Prince Andrew denies the allegations. He denies he ever even met Virginia Giuffre. But even by his own admission, he was very good friends with someone who's now been convicted of being a sex trafficker. And I think most people will agree that can only reflect negatively on him.
OK, Chris, many thanks. The number of people in hospital with COVID-19 in the UK has risen to nearly 12,000. It comes as 90% of those eligible have now been reported to have had a first dose of the vaccine. Nightingale wards are being set up in preparation for a potential surge in Omicron hospital admissions. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan reports.
The NHS is on a war footing. Nearly 12,000 people are now in hospital with COVID in the UK, the most since early March. Around 3/4 of those were admitted because of the COVID, the rest for other conditions. And although COVID treatments are improving, staff morale is not.
I just can't describe to you, the kind of sinking feeling that you don't have the resources to do the best for your patients.
Yet the NHS is still having to prepare for the possible consequences of the surge in Omicron cases. From next week, construction of Nightingale hubs will start at 8 hospitals, including the Lister in Stevenage, to provide extra capacity for patients who aren't yet well enough to go home. But as with the original Nightingale hospitals, the issue may not be having enough beds, but having enough staff.
We do not doubt that the public require those services and the care and treatment that those services will provide. Our concern is, how do we get an already exhausted workforce spread themselves even more across those additional 4,000 beds?
Medics say the vast majority of people in intensive care with COVID have not been fully vaccinated. So there was particular outrage after anti-vax campaigners entered a testing centre in Milton Keynes yesterday and carried off equipment. Thames Valley Police say they are reviewing the incident. The Health Secretary tweeted, "I was appalled to see Piers Corbyn and his mob threaten NHS test and trace staff who are working so hard to keep people safe. This kind of vile behaviour is unacceptable." But Labour want action against online disinformation.
The government should be doing a lot more to clamp down on that and to demand of the platforms of which many of these people rely, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and so on, to get rid of this content and to close down some of these accounts because they're spreading lies.
Nevertheless, new figures show more than 90% of people over the age of 12 have now had at least one jab. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
Boris Johnson is set to be cleared of breaking the ministerial code over his Downing Street flat refurbishment. But the Financial Times reports that Lord Geidt, who conducted the internal Whitehall inquiry, told colleagues the Prime Minister's behaviour is deeply unsatisfactory and that the situation is a total mess. A man killed in an explosion outside Liverpool Women's Hospital last month had used his flat as a bomb-making factory, an inquest has heard. Imad al-Swalimin was killed when his homemade device went off in the back of a taxi on Remembrance Sunday. The inquest heard he had been buying materials used to make explosives, including 2,000 ball bearings. A coroner ruled the bomb was made with murderous intent and said it was fortunate that there was only one victim. He said it was unclear whether he intended the device to detonate when it did. Santander is trying to claw back £130 million it accidentally paid out to customers on Christmas Day. Around 75,000 people and companies were paid twice by the bank. It's thought Santander may have to rely on the kindness of others to get back the money. And average UK house prices rose by record levels this year, up nearly £24,000. In December, the cost of a typical home reached just under £255,000, another record high. Nationwide, said prices are now 16% higher than before the pandemic. In a simple wooden coffin, the body of Archbishop Desmond Tutu was carried into a cathedral in Cape Town today. Large crowds are expected as the body lies in state before the funeral on New Year's Day. Across South Africa, services of thanksgiving have been held for the life of a man who was a central figure in the anti-apartheid movement. Rebecca Barry reports.
The body of Archbishop Desmond Tutu brought to the cathedral in Cape Town, where he used to preach against apartheid. His daughter expressing the sense of loss felt by so many. A simple wooden coffin carried the Nobel Peace Prize winner. He'd requested no ostentatiousness or lavish spending. Here, his body will lie in state until his funeral on Saturday. One of those paying their respects, Nelson Mandela's grandson, who said the Arch, as he was known, was never afraid to challenge Mandela.
Arch always challenged my grandfather and pushed him, particularly on issues they did for the
People queued for hours to say their goodbyes.
We will just remember him for his love and his power and his outspokenness between right and wrong.
It's an honour and a blessing for me to be here today to say my final goodbyes to the Arch, who has done so much for this country.
Meanwhile, at a service in Johannesburg, they celebrated a life remembered with joy and affection. Rebecca Barry, ITV News.
Manchester United have won 3-1 against Burnley tonight. An opener from Scott McTominay and a tap-in from Cristiano Ronaldo put them in the lead in the first half. And an own goal from Burnley's Ben Mee didn't help Burnley's cause. Burnley's Aaron Lennon got one back in the second half, but it wasn't enough. And that is it for now. From everyone here, good night.